coming down here, I was thinking, it's 2020, and I always think of some of you. I've told the story too, how my father's family became Adventists in this town. They were Presbyterians. They'd shifted up here in 1916. And of course, 1918, 1919, what happened in this town and a whole lot of other towns, there was the Spanish flu. I thought, things don't change much, do they? We don't call it the Spanish flu, but we've got this COVID-19 threatening us. And my dad came, he was a 12-year-old boy, and he came down with the Spanish flu. And the Seventh-day Adventist minister in this town, I suppose they were worshipping in the old hall that was just there behind us, went and delivered a box of lemons to the family. And my grandmother credited that box of lemons with saving my father's life because he recovered. So interesting, like if it hadn't been for the Spanish flu, hadn't been for a box of lemons, I might not be here today. And it shows you can never underestimate the power of a good deed. I remember my dad telling him a bit later after that, he went to stay with the Adventist minister for a weekend. And he said he was astounded because they're being good Presbyterians. He said they didn't do any work on the Sunday. And the minister got up and was chopping wood on Sunday morning. And he said he couldn't believe. He said, I thought this guy was a minister. What's he doing chopping the firewood on a Sunday morning? So there, it's a small world. I just wanted to look because of this from 1 Peter a little bit there, hope in a hostile world. Peter's epistle, 1 Peter's epistle, really about how we can have hope in what is a hostile world. And it was addressed to the early Christians. But there's so much which the early Christians were facing that we face today. The world has not changed as much as we may think. And what Peter says to the early Christians is quite pertinent to us today. How we need to behave, how we can maintain our hope at a time when things seem... When you look at the world today, the world is a mess. Here we are struggling with this virus which seems to be spreading further and further, and we're waiting that hopefully they'll find something that will cure it. Wars and rumours of wars, all sorts of troubles out there, and let's just draw a few parallels between what was happening when Peter was writing to the early church and our world today. Oops. I don't know whether I got this turned on properly or not. Let's try that. Yes, success. If you put the switch to on, it works. Let's look at 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 to 12. And this is Peter says, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that he visits us. And so Peter's saying, if you live lives that glorify God, you will win over these people when they see the things that you are doing, the lives that you are living. On the day that God visits us, the second coming, they will be ready as well as you when he comes. And that's what he's saying to... this was written we think the latest now is that this was written in AD 67. The church was not terribly large at that stage. They were very much in a minority, and they were in a pagan world. If you go to Rome, you can go and visit the Pantheon. Magnificent building, I can tell you. It was built just a few years later after Peter had written those verses. And when you go inside the Pantheon, at the back you can see it's a big round building. Pantheon means all the gods, doesn't it? And the Romans believed in a whole range of gods. And this one is built in honour of all the major Roman gods that the pagan world at the time when Peter wrote would have been worshipping. So the world, as far as the pagans were concerned, most of the time they believed that these gods weren't really interested in you very much at all. And you had to get their attention if you wanted anything from them. In addition to that, there were all these minor gods. Every valley, every spring, there was gods associated with those as well. Myriads of them they believed in. And that was the pagan world that these people were living in, these early Christians. And they were in a very distinct minority when Peter wrote to them. One of the things that is a relief that somebody had carved out way back at the time, and you can see they're heading off to make sacrifice. One of the major sacrifices, they had sacrificed a pig, a sheep, and a cattle beast. And the idea was if you do a favour for the gods would in turn, they believed that the life force from these animals was transferred to the gods, and so you've done them a favour. So therefore, they will do something good for you. And that was the way they thought. And the Christians were in a world where they didn't go along with this, and so they were sometimes in trouble. If you look, this is the Roman Empire. It was extensive, wasn't it? You can see all the way up to Britain up here, all the way over through what is now Iran, Iraq, etc. North Africa. There's a whole. It was a huge. This is the largest it had spread out through, and so they were part of a huge empire made up of many different people, and when estimates of how many there were, they said around about AD 40, probably only about 4,000. One of the latest estimates. Christians in the whole of a world sort of that sort of size. They were barely noticed. By AD 200, the estimate is there was about 218,000. So there's still a very tiny segment. They're not very important in terms of the scheme of things. And by AD 300, they reckon there were about 34 million of them. There's a phenomenal growth in Christianity over the first 2 or 3 centuries. Quite amazing what happened. And after 300, they were making up nearly about half of the population of the Roman world. So they went from being tiny, insignificant, to actually making up the majority of the empire. If you look early on, these are where the early churches were. You can see over here, North Africa, Cyrene. There's Simon of Cyrene who carried the cross of Jesus. That's where he would have come from. And you see, they're spread out where Paul went in Asia Minor, over in Greece and Macedonia, and then up in Italy. These were the places where the Christians had started to penetrate and started to spread. Now, what was the date that I said for Peter's epistle? AD 67. AD 64, this happened. It was the Great Fire of Rome. And what happened was 19th of July, we know the exact date that it broke out, and it burned for 6 days in Rome. And devastated Rome. There's a lot, you'll see pictures, some people portray Nero as sitting there playing his fiddle while, but that's probably fictitious. He is actually down in the Bay of Naples when it broke out. But one thing, Nero was delighted when it happened because he wanted to rebuild Rome, and this gave him the opportunity that he wanted. After 6 days, it seemed that the fire was out, then it flared up again for another 3 days, and there were reports that some of Nero's troops were out there actually spreading the fire a little bit further because there were bits of Rome that Nero wanted to rebuild in, and so therefore the fire hadn't done quite as good a job as he had hoped. People became suspicious, and people began to look at Nero and say, you did this. And so Nero looks around and he says, no, I need to blame somebody else. And so he goes and he says, the small group of people called the Christians will blame them. And so people were already suspicious of them. They met on this unusual day. They talked that they were cannibals because they said they drank the blood and ate the body of the god they worshipped. These rumours had gone out there. So it wasn't a very difficult job for Nero to put the blame on them. And as a result of that, the first real persecution of the Christians started in a big way. And you know, the cruelty of some of those people are beyond belief. Some of them were sewn into wild animal skins and tossed to the animals and the lions in the Colosseum. Some of them were put up on poles covered in oil and set on fire to light the Colosseum and to light Nero's garden in his palace. Terrible things happened, and the Roman people seemed to delight in going along to festivals where there was cruelty, gladiators fighting, or animals being put to death. And so the Christians then, for a while, suffered greatly. But one thing that this persecution did was to spread out the Christians further through the empire. They were clustered in some of the main cities up until that stage, but as the persecutions came and they would leave to go to the safer places, they would take their beliefs with them and they would spread. Hence, Nero, and all these people who were trying to get rid of Christianity, it was very counterproductive. Christianity spread. They didn't manage to put it out. So the world of the early Christians was a difficult world. You know, one of the things that had happened in the world at their time was, you know, we talk about COVID-19 like it's a novelty, isn't it? These pandemics are nothing new. They've been around for centuries. And in the Roman world, they lived in a world where these pandemics, where smallpox or measles or whatever it happened to be, would come around and the cities would basically be emptied. People would leave. And one thing we know is that when the most people left, the Christians were the ones who remained in the cities and looked after the people who were sick, often paying with their own lives as a result of doing this. Doing good deeds. When families who had fled would return and found that great uncle was still alive and had been cared for by Christians and probably had become one himself, they were astounded. So they lived in this. There was a world of corruption. It was a world of persecution. It was a world of plague. It was a world of infanticide. Especially female babies, would be taken down and left on the banks of the river, and it was the Christians who would go and would pick up these children and bring them up as their own. And so these are the people that Peter is writing to. You know, when he talks about the pagans, these are the people who have been trying to put them to death, and yet he's saying, live good lives so they will glorify God as a result of what you do. It's a time of great high infant mortality. Very few parents got to see all their children grow up. They would die early. And so this is the world in which the early Christians, and when you think of it, we're spared many of these things, but the world is uncertain. And the world is a place which is quite dangerous and becoming more so today. And if we look at some of the things that... In 312, the year 312, this man, I don't know if he actually looked like this, Constantine was battling to get control of the Roman Empire. At one of the bridges, he was going to conduct a battle, and supposedly he saw the sign of the cross in the sky, and he got the message, by this sign conquer. Well, he marched his army through a river, turned them all Christian overnight. They were all baptised. And he won the battle, and he did become the emperor. What he actually was doing is there were so many Christians in the empire at this time. It was a case of political expediency. He knew the way things were cast. He knew that if he could get the Christians on side with him, things would go much better. And a year later, in 313, he issued the Edict of Milan, where he actually made it possible for people, you could worship in a Christian worship and not be persecuted anymore. And so for the first, 250 odd years, these Christians had suffered greatly, but they had grown in numbers. But they lived in a time of social upheaval, anxiety and fear. And Constantine's reign actually meant that, because 324, he then changed the day in which he said which will be the official day of worship from Saturday to Sunday. So Constantine, he didn't actually become a Christian himself at that stage, although he was tolerant. It wasn't until he got baptised on his deathbed quite a few years later. He must have believed that the Christian message was right eventually. And so, here we go. Here's a group of people today. This was actually one I thought I'd find a picture from this was the Wairarapa Wine Festival. I checked it out. I didn't see any of you there. So, but I thought, if we look at a segment of the society that we mix in, how would they compare to the society that the Christians at the time when Peter wrote, how would they compare to that time? And what we notice is in New Zealand, the number of people who consider themselves Christian is going down all the time. When they did the last census, they discovered that 37% of people classified themselves as Christian. 55% have no belief or don't know what they believe when they filled in the census form. So Christians are in the minority. Now we might say 37%, but if you took out 37% of that crowd, a local Wairarapa crowd, I suspect you wouldn't find 37% of them are going to turn up at church tomorrow. So you do have, I might say 37% might say they're Christian, but many are nominally Christian, in name only. I think if 37% of the population of Masterton turned up to church tomorrow, I think all the vicars and priests and whoever out there would be absolutely stunned. They probably wouldn't have the space to get available. So what I'm saying is that Christians are in a minority just like they were in the early Christian church. The other thing that astounded me, when you look at the census figures, the fastest growing religion in New Zealand is Hinduism. Would never have believed it years ago, So Hinduism is the fastest growing religion in New Zealand at this time. And so we live in a world of unbelievers, many who are hostile to Christianity. You go into the schools and they're taught evolution. When you teach in a state school, you can't say anything about religion. That's one of the things I liked about being able to teach at Longbourn, was you could talk about your faith and your beliefs with your students. And in fact, I could always see the irony of it when the ERO used to come, the Educational Review Office people would come in to check, and they would be atheists and agnostics, most of them, but they're checking to see that you're being true to the special character of the school. I thought, how great is that? So you get the atheists in to check that we're actually fulfilling the Christian message in our school. But we live in a world where, you go to a state school and if you try and say something, then you'll be cut down. Not allowed to. You go out there and you find there are plenty of people who are intolerant. we've just seen, in the parliamentary prayer that we have in our parliament now, the latest speaker has said, no, we will have no reference to Jesus Christ. So it's no longer a Christian prayer that they open Parliament with. It's just some general sort of prayer that anybody could offer. So we've become a very secular society, just like, probably not what we'd call pagan, but to all intents and purposes, very like the pagan society that the Christians grew up. And, when you think of it, when Israel was taken out of Egypt and moved to the Promised Land, they were in a pagan society surrounded by it. God didn't want them to take on the paganism that was around them, the beliefs. One of them was following the Moloch, where they offered their children as sacrifices to the so-called god Moloch. And too often when we read about the children of Israel, they succumb to those that were around them. It's a difficulty, isn't it? We're in a minority, we're in the midst of a society which is anti-Christian. They were in the midst of a society that didn't believe in the true God. And we've got to be careful that we don't follow along and compromise so that our beliefs and our standards end up going down the way that were never intended. If you look at the world, this is the latest figures. This is the persecution of Christians in the world. The darker orange is where there's extreme persecution, like Libya, down in the Sudan. I was surprised India, Pakistan, Iraq and Iran, I knew they would be in amongst there. But it shows you that, we live in a world where Christianity and probably most of the world is not tolerated. Life can be very difficult. You can see where it goes to yellow it's still high persecution. Because places like Russia, where if you're Orthodox Christian, you're okay, but if you're Seventh-day Adventist, life becomes very difficult. China, you can see, go back. China is. Christian message a few years ago was spreading, the gospel was spreading so fast in China, we don't know how rapidly it is spreading at the moment. Hopefully, and we pray that those people who accepted Christianity in China are remaining faithful, but the government, no wonder the government of China is so against Christians, because they feared that it was likely to become the dominant religion of China if it had kept going at the pace that it was going in the last 20 years. So they tell us that probably around 400 Christians every day are martyred. We can't think of those figures. You can't imagine. We live in a place where you can come in on a Sabbath and you can worship and nobody really does anything to you. But in a large part of the world, Christians are unable to do that. Many of them are paying with their lives. And it's just as it was back in the 1st and 2nd centuries in many ways. Things have not... And we would be very foolhardy to think that this situation will bypass us. But when you see what is happening in the United States at the moment, it makes you go, the mob can rule at the drop of a hat. And we need to be aware of that. So, and I just want to introduce you to these two Iranian ladies. I found their story. I don't know if I can pronounce the names properly. Mazia and Miriam. And they were brought up Muslims in Iran. Both of them, independent of each other, became Christian at the age of 17. Miraculous story, how they both ended up having dreams, messages from God to tell them about what, they said, well, we had this Bible called the Barnabas Bible, which is the one that the government in Iran will let you have, which says that, yes, Jesus was a great prophet, but Muhammad is coming. And they said, well, we didn't really believe that. And so they ended up receiving dreams, doing study, and they both became young Christian ladies. Both went to Turkey with their study. And when they were in Turkey, they must have met up. They returned to Tehran, and they shared an apartment in Tehran. And they decided they wanted to do more to spread the gospel in Iran. These are brave women, yeah, unbelievable. So they contacted someone back in Turkey, said, can we have copies of the New Testament to spread in our city? And what would the New Testaments would arrive secretly? They would put them in their backpacks. They would go out at night and they'd pray. They didn't know where they should put them, but they'd feel impressed to go to a certain part of the city, and they were passing out New Testaments into the letterboxes. They distributed 20,000 New Testaments in Tehran until they were caught. And when they were caught, they were taken to Evin prison, which is one of the most notorious prisons in Tehran. And they were charged, because you cannot convert to Christianity, and you certainly can't hand out Bibles, and they used to have meetings in their little apartment, and you certainly can't hold a church meeting in your apartment. Well, they were charged on all 3 counts. And so they were put into this prison. And they recall, they said, at first we prayed that God would set us free. They asked God, somehow deliver us from this prison. Then they said, after a while we realised we are able to witness for Jesus in the prison. So they stopped praying that God would set them free, and they started saying, God, please take us to the people that need to know your gospel. As a result of that, they got to, first of all, they were shunned by many of the other prisons, called them the dirty Christians. Then, later on, some of the prison guards would actually come in and ask for their prayers. Such was the influence that they had. They were under threat of death. Every time they would be taken in front of the judge who became annoyed with them because they wouldn't change their minds, used to say, all I need is one sentence saying that you convert back from Christianity to Islam, and you are free. And they wouldn't do it. They even had a lawyer who used to say, oh no, you need to just go back to Islam. It's all right. If you can tell a lie when you're, if it's for your own special benefit. You don't have to always tell the truth. Just convert back, and then you can tell a lie, and things won't matter. And they wouldn't do it. And they kept being threatened with death, but as they said, well, death. They kept telling the judge, it's not death that worries us. We can accept death. We just don't want to ever be unfaithful to our Lord. A lot of people in the West heard about these two and prayed for them, and there was a lot of political pressure went in on the Iran government, and eventually they were freed and kicked out of the country. They now both live in the United States. And amazing hearing their story, talking about how today we need to pray for these people in Iran today, the difficult situation they have. But they say they're optimistic. They say things are changing in Iran. The constant pressure that Trump, of all people, is putting on the government in Iran is having effect on that country. And he said people are now becoming more aware of their rights and not just doing as the mullahs tell us. And the gospel is spreading. The underground church in Iran is growing rapidly, largely led by women, miraculously. And so these are two special people who have done their, put up with incredible persecution, been faithful, and God has delivered them. but there'll be many more like them over there. What can we learn? You know, Peter has a lot to say in 1 Peter about how we should live in a pagan world, in a difficult situation. Paul has bits to say throughout his writings if you go through. Mostly he is addressing specifically a message to the Christians, and every now and then he slips in a little bit saying, and this is how you need to live in the world around you where you are surrounded by the pagans. One thing he makes very clear, salvation and mercy is for everyone. We mentioned it in the lesson this morning. Salvation and mercy is for everyone. We need to get the mindset that it's not just for us. It's out there for all the believers out in the world, all the ones around, those that despise us. It's for them as well. And we need to make certain that we don't build up the walls around us. You know, I remember when I was a student at Longburn many years ago, and a new student arrived, Robert Bell. He actually contacted me a few years ago, believe it or not. And Robert Bell was not a Seventh-day Adventist. And we used to look at him and think, how did you get in here? Because everybody else was. How did you... We had the mentality that we had the walls up, the place was a fortress, and we're keeping all the unbelievers out. Well, we need to get rid of that, and we need to be prepared to interact and realise that the gospel message is not just for us. It is for us, but it's for everyone. Paul says in Romans 13 that we must respect authority. Those that are placed in authority over. Sometimes we look at them and we think, I don't think they deserve it. But even if that's our belief, we still need to show respect and to follow, except where they tell us to do things that are contrary to the Word of God. So, yes, avoid all immorality. The world in those days immorality was rife. Very few marriages lasted very long. And so no wonder Paul, when he's talking to the Corinthians, says you need to avoid all forms of immorality. That way, you don't compromise yourself with the rest of society. And then he gives a bit in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he gives some advice to those who are married to unbelievers. Because there were many mixed, maybe the husband or maybe the wife had converted and the spouse was no longer, hadn't converted. And he says, live in peace with each other. Only separate when you both agree that that's the best for you. But he says, in other ways, don't use your Christianity as an excuse to break your marriage up. And he talks about slaves and masters to be faithful to each other. We might say, well, hang on, I haven't got any slaves, so this doesn't apply to me. But I think there are times when we all have the sort of slave mentality, when we're labouring away at the minimum wage or something like that, and we think, why am I doing all this work and they're only paying me, $17 an hour or whatever it happens to be. I can't keep up with it now. But maybe I can take some shortcuts. Paul was saying to the slaves back in those days, no, you don't take shortcuts. If you're doing a job, you do it properly. If you own, he was radical, he wasn't revolutionary. Some people condemn Paul, say, well, why didn't you go and condemn slavery? Remember, he's part of a religion that is a very small part of the empire at this stage. And if he had gone away and written, we're going to do away with slavery, boy, the powers that be have come down on top of the Christians so heavily that it would have been totally counterproductive. He was radical, because he says, there's neither slave nor free, bond, statements like that. Paul was, for his age, was actually quite amazing what he would say. Neither Jew nor Greek, And people would have said, no, you can't say things like that, Paul. But that's what he wrote. But slaves and masters to remain faithful to each other and to look after each other. The slave was to work, so he was working for the Lord. The master was to treat his slave with respect and kindness. Avoid idleness and do not be a burden to others. You know, independence is a great virtue when you're in a minority in the world. If you you're not beholden to a whole lot of other. You remember when Paul would go around, how he would support himself, making tents? And he says a number of times in his epistles, you know, I was never a burden on you. I looked at, you know, I paid. He bought his lunch every time for himself. He didn't rely on others to do things. And one of the things in the world, and you know, when you're in a minority group like we are, it's often important if we can have our independence. Not always possible. And idleness and the willingness to work means that we are not beholden on others. He also, you know, talks about meat offered to idols, because this was another thing the early Christians had to contend with. He says, you know, the butchers' shops in those days were the temples. So when they killed a big beast or something like that, one of the ways you'd defray the cost, they were very expensive in those days, you would sometimes go down there with your friends if you were a pagan, and you would eat some of it, and then the rest of it would be put on sale. If you wanted some meat, where did you go? You went to the temples and you bought the meat that was put up for sale. And Paul recognised that this was upsetting some of the early Christians. And he says, you know, well, idols aren't real, so it doesn't, you know, in his own, those that are strong in the faith, well, it doesn't mean anything to them that it's been offered to an idol. But he points out something. He says, but don't be a stumbling block to others. And we today need to make certain that we don't get our religion to create it to become a stumbling block for other people. So a lot of what the advice that was given is advice that, you know, it's nearly 2,000 years old, but it's still advice that we can take on board today living in our society. In Timothy, he says this, fix this picture firmly in your mind. Jesus descended from the line of David, raised from the dead. It's what you've heard from me all along. It's what I'm sitting in jail for right now. But God's word isn't in jail. That's why I stick it out here, so that everyone God calls will get in on the salvation of Christ in all its glory. What Paul says is, you know, he wrote to Timothy. Paul was imprisoned in Rome. He knew what was coming up. He knew he was going to be put to death. But he says we must remain faithful. And we live in a day and an age where remaining faithful is a key thing that we need to be careful about. We need to remain faithful, and we need to never forget the prize that waits at the end. Because if we're faithful, we know that the day will come when Jesus will appear, and we will be rewarded in ways in which we can never believe. You know, I haven't seen or ear heard those things which are being prepared for us. So let's just go through some of 1 Peter, we're at chapter 2 again. I've taken this out of the Message. It's a paraphrase, but I love the way that it's put. And I think it makes it very understandable. And he says, but you are the ones chosen by God, chosen for the high calling of priestly work, chosen to be a holy people, God's instruments to do his work and speak out for him, to tell others of the night and day difference that he made for you, from nothing to something, from rejected to accepted. Friends, this world is not your home, so don't make yourselves cosy in it. Don't indulge your ego at the expense of your soul. Live an exemplary life among the natives so that your actions will refute their prejudices. Then they'll be won over to God's side and be there to join in the celebrations when he arrives. Just make the Master proud of you by being good citizens. Respect the authorities, whatever their level. They are God's emissaries for keeping order. It is God's will that by doing good you might cure the ignorance of the fools who think you are a danger to society. Exercise your freedom by serving God, not by breaking the rules. Treat everyone you meet with dignity. Love your spiritual family. Revere God. Respect the government. That was advice nearly 2,000 years old. But it's advice which today is still very relevant and pertinent to us. That we remain faithful, that we carry out the instructions that people like Peter and Paul have left for us, so that when that day comes, and when we look around the world today, we can see it's getting closer, we'll be ready and faithful and go home with him. God bless you.